When my Uncle Richard Carter died, the silence in that old stone church was heavier than any hymn could ever be. It wasn't grief that kept everyone quiet, it was disdain. He'd been hated in life, and now, even in death, people couldn't bring themselves to offer him a single kind word. The stained glass windows threw streaks of red and blue across the wooden pews, but no one moved toward the pulpit. That space, where countless sermons had been spoken, stood empty, like the man himself had left behind nothing worth remembering. I sat in the second row, staring at the bowed heads of my cousins, the stiff shoulders of the company executives who owed their careers to him, and even the priest, who looked like he was just waiting for it all to be over. No one wanted to speak. No one dared to soften the edges of Richard's legacy. My name is Ethan Morris. Growing up under Richard's shadow was like walking barefoot on broken glass. He had this way of cutting you down, even when you thought you'd done something right. No matter the achievement, he'd find the flaw. While others admired his business empire and his sharp mind, I only saw the man who looked me in the eye and told me I'd never amount to anything. And yet, sitting there, in that drafty church, watching the silence stretch on, I felt something twist inside me. If no one spoke, he'd go to the grave with nothing but bitterness echoing behind him. Maybe that was justice. Maybe it was what he deserved. But part of me couldn't stomach the thought. Before I knew it, I was on my feet. The wooden floor creaked under my shoes, and I felt dozens of eyes follow me as I walked down the aisle. My chest was tight, my throat dry, but I kept moving. The closer I got to the pulpit, the more my mind screamed, "What the hell are you doing, Ethan?" I stood there, staring out at faces that were half curious, half disbelieving, and I began to speak. I told them about a man who was wise, patient, and generous. A man who guided his family with love, who built not just a company, but a legacy of compassion. Every word was a lie, and yet they flowed as if they'd been waiting inside me all along. As I spoke, something strange happened. People leaned in. Some wiped their eyes. They weren't listening to Richard Carter's story. They were listening to the story they wished had been true. And for a fleeting moment, I wondered if I was giving them a gift or just fooling myself. The guilt gnawed at me with every sentence, but at the same time, I felt a rush of relief. For the first time, my voice didn't tremble under Richard's shadow. For the first time, the room was listening to me. I finished the eulogy with words that painted him as a man of principle and quiet strength. I stepped down from the pulpit to a silence that was different now, not the silence of contempt, but the silence of people holding back tears. I sat down, my heart still pounding, and for a brief second, I almost believed the story I'd just told. But deep down, I knew the real story was only beginning. When I sat back down, the wooden pew groaned under me, as if the old church itself knew I'd just crossed a line. My hands trembled slightly, though I tried to hide it by lacing my fingers together. Around me, people sniffled, dabbed their eyes, nodded solemnly, as if my words had reached some tender place inside them. But I couldn't ignore the knot in my gut. I had just lied in front of an entire congregation, lied about a man who never gave a damn about anyone but himself, lied about a man who had mocked me at 16 when I told him I wanted to study business, sneering that I'd never survive a single semester, lied about a man who left scars on this family that still hadn't healed. And yet, there they were, my cousins, my uncle's business partners, even distant relatives I barely recognized, holding on to every fabricated word like it was gospel. Across the aisle, my cousin Amanda shot me a look, not one of gratitude or relief, but suspicion. Her lips curled into something between a smirk and a sneer, like she'd just caught me red-handed. She leaned over to her brother and whispered something, both of them shaking their heads. The doubt hit me harder than the silence had. What if they called me out? What if someone stood up and shouted, "That's not who Richard Carter was"? Because if anyone deserved to be remembered truthfully, it sure as hell wasn't my uncle. But no one spoke, not a word. The priest gave me a polite nod before moving on with the service, and slowly, the tension in the air loosened. I'd given Richard the one thing no one else wanted to: dignity. False dignity, but dignity nonetheless. After the closing prayer, people rose to their feet, coats rustling, shoes clicking against the stone floor. Conversations broke out in hushed tones, the kind you hear when people don't know whether to gossip or grieve. I felt the weight of every glance, every nod, every hand that briefly touched my shoulder, as if to say, "Thank you for doing what we couldn't." But not everyone was thankful. As we filed out of the church into the cold New England air, Amanda caught up to me. She was shorter than me, but her stare could cut a man down to size. That was quite the fairy tale, Ethan, almost convincing. Almost. Her brother, Greg, stood just behind her, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. "You think you're clever, don't you? Standing up there, rewriting history? Richard hated you, and you hated him. Everyone knows it." I clenched my jaw, resisting the urge to fire back. They weren't wrong. Richard and I had been like oil and water, sparks flying every time we were in the same room. But what good would the truth have done? Did they really want me to stand up there and say, "Good riddance, the bastard's finally gone"? Instead, I said nothing. Sometimes silence is stronger than any comeback. I let Amanda's words hang in the frosty air until she finally scoffed and turned away. I thought that was the end of it, just family tension spilling out like it always did. But then I noticed a man watching me from the church steps. Older, dressed in a dark coat that looked more tailored than anything else in sight. His silver hair caught the weak afternoon light, and his eyes stayed fixed on me with a sharpness that made me uncomfortable. I recognized him instantly. Charles Whitman, my uncle's lawyer. He didn't approach right away. He let me walk down the stone steps, shake hands with a few distant relatives, listen to half-hearted condolences. Only when the crowd began to thin did he step forward. "Mr. Morris," he said, extending a gloved hand. His voice carried authority, the kind that made you straighten your back without realizing it. I took his hand, feeling the firm grip, the unspoken weight behind his words. "I only said what needed to be said," I replied carefully. He studied me for a moment, his gaze steady, almost too steady. Then, with the faintest trace of a smile, he leaned closer and spoke just low enough for me to hear. "Congratulations, Ethan. You just passed your uncle's final test." The words froze me in place. For a second, the world around me dimmed. The chatter, the footsteps, even the sound of a passing car outside the church. I could only hear his voice, replaying those words over and over. A test? Richard's final test? I opened my mouth to ask what the hell he meant, but Charles had already stepped back, his expression unreadable. "We'll be in touch soon," he said, before slipping into the crowd and vanishing like smoke. And just like that, the lie I told at the funeral stopped feeling like the end of something and started feeling like the beginning. I couldn't get Charles Whitman's words out of my head. My uncle's final test. They played over and over, louder than the church bells echoing faintly across the square. I slipped my hands into my coat pockets, hoping the biting wind would clear my thoughts, but it only sharpened them. What kind of man sets a test from beyond the grave? Richard Carter wasn't the type to write sentimental farewell letters or leave behind riddles. He was the kind of man who slammed doors, barked orders, and left broken glass in his wake. And yet, Whitman had said it like it was obvious, like this was all part of Richard's plan. That night, lying awake in my apartment, the memory of the eulogy twisted inside me. I pictured my cousins whispering, the smirk on Amanda's face, the quiet nod from the priest. I thought of how my voice had filled that hollow church, weaving a story that didn't belong to me or to Richard. I'd made him into a saint, a man of honor and integrity, the kind of man I'd wished he had been. And they'd all bought it. But here's the thing no one tells you. When you tell a lie big enough, even if it's just once, it doesn't just vanish into thin air. It sticks. It echoes. It changes the way people look at you and the way you look at yourself. For the first time in years, I felt the weight of my uncle's presence even after he was gone. Not the weight of his criticism, but something stranger, something heavier. Like he'd left me with one last responsibility, though I hadn't agreed to carry it. The following morning, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. Against my better judgment, I picked up. Mr. Morris? The voice was crisp, measured. I didn't need to ask who it was. Mr. Whitman, I said, sitting up straighter on the edge of the bed. I'd like you to come by my office this afternoon. There are matters regarding your uncle's estate we need to discuss. The line went dead before I could respond. By noon, I was sitting in a leather chair across from Charles Whitman, surrounded by shelves of thick law books and framed certificates that screamed legacy and authority. He didn't waste time with small talk. Your uncle was a difficult man, he began, steepling his fingers. I suspect you know that better than most. I gave a dry laugh. That's one way to put it. Whitman's eyes narrowed just slightly, like he was measuring me. And yet, yesterday you stood up in front of a room full of people and painted him as a man of wisdom and compassion. My stomach nodded. What was I supposed to do? Leave the pulpit empty? Let silence define him? He leaned back, studying me. No, you did exactly what he hoped someone would. The room went cold. I rubbed my palms against my knees. Are you saying he planned this? Whitman reached into a drawer, pulled out a sealed envelope, and slid it across the desk. My name, Ethan Morris, was scrawled in Richard's familiar handwriting. He left this for you, he said quietly. I wasn't to deliver it unless you spoke at his funeral. My pulse hammered in my ears. I stared at the envelope like it was a live wire. My uncle, even in death, had me trapped in his games. I tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of thick paper, folded once. The handwriting was sharp, deliberate. If you can speak well of me when no one else will, perhaps you are ready to take what others cannot. My house, my company, my secrets. They're yours now. But know this, truth is heavier than lies, and you'll need to carry both. I set the letter down, my throat dry. My uncle had left me everything. But sitting in that office, with Whitman's steady gaze fixed on me, I realized the house and the company weren't the reward. They were the burden, and I had no idea what kind of secrets were waiting for me inside that mansion. 2 days later, I stood in front of the Carter mansion, clutching the keys Charles Whitman had handed me like they were a sentence instead of a gift. The place loomed at the end of a long, winding driveway, its stone facade weathered but unshakable, tall windows reflecting the gray New England sky. I'd been here countless times as a kid, dragged along to family dinners that felt more like interrogations. But standing at those iron gates now, knowing it was mine, it felt different, heavy. The gates creaked open when I pressed the remote Whitman had given me. As I drove up, gravel crunching under the tires, I couldn't shake the feeling that Richard was still watching me somehow, like the house itself had absorbed his gaze, cold and unyielding. The front door was heavier than I remembered. I stepped into the foyer, the air stale, carrying faint hints of leather, dust, and cigar smoke. A massive staircase spiraled upward, portraits of long-dead Carters lining the walls. Their eyes followed me the way Richard used to, silently demanding something I never felt I had. I wandered through room after room, the library with its towering shelves, the study with its mahogany desk, the dining room where Richard had once belittled me in front of half the family. Every corner whispered a memory, most of them bitter. And then there was the office, the one room no one had been allowed in except Richard himself. The key slid into the lock with a soft click, and the door swung open. The office was everything I expected, immaculate, intimidating, and designed to remind anyone who entered that they were smaller than Richard Carter. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the estate grounds. On the wall hung a massive oil painting of Richard himself, staring down with that same smirk I knew too well. But it was the safe that drew my attention. Whitman had mentioned it briefly. "There are things in there you'll want to see," he'd said, as if he hadn't already dropped a bomb on my life with that letter. The safe was built into the wall behind a sliding panel, old but sturdy. I tried the combination Whitman had scribbled for me, 4219. A birthday, maybe? Or something darker. With a heavy clunk, the safe opened. Inside, I found more than money. There were files, thick folders bound with leather straps, ledgers, contracts, letters sealed in envelopes yellowed with age. And then, tucked neatly on top, a smaller box. I opened it. Inside were photographs, dozens of them. Some of me as a child, baseball games, school plays, even my high school graduation. Pictures I never knew existed, moments I never thought my uncle cared enough to attend, let alone capture. My chest tightened. For a second, I felt something almost like grief. Had he been watching all along? Had Richard cared in some twisted, hidden way? Or was this just another part of his test? I dug deeper into the folders, scanning contracts with names I recognized from his company, deals that didn't look clean, numbers that didn't add up. Richard had left me his empire, but buried inside it were secrets that could destroy everything. The floor creaked behind me. I spun around, heart racing. But no one was there, just the empty hallway, the echo of my own breathing. Still, the feeling lingered, that I wasn't alone, that by opening that safe, I hadn't just inherited Richard's house or company. I'd inherited his enemies, too. I closed the safe, the lock snapping shut with a finality that made my stomach turn. For years, I'd thought Richard's shadow would vanish once he was gone. But standing there in his office, surrounded by his secrets, I realized the truth. His shadow hadn't disappeared. It had settled on me. I barely slept the night after opening the safe. The papers, the photos, the secrets, they haunted me long after I shut the heavy steel door. By morning, the air in the mansion felt thicker, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. But I didn't have long to sit with the weight of it. By the time I pulled into Whitman's office the next afternoon, Amanda and Greg were already there. Both of them. Waiting. Amanda stood by the window, arms folded tight across her chest. Greg leaned back in a chair, one leg crossed over the other, looking like he owned the place. The moment I stepped in, their eyes locked on me, sharp and burning. "Well, if it isn't the golden boy," Greg said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Or should I say, the golden liar? I clenched my jaw. Morning to you too, Greg. Amanda cut in before he could keep going. Let's not waste time. Charles already told us about the will, about what Uncle Richard left you. Her voice was cold, clipped. And we're here to make something very clear. We're not going to stand by and let you waltz off with what should have been ours. Whitman, who had been sitting calmly behind his desk, cleared his throat. The will was properly executed. Mr. Carter's wishes are legally binding. Ethan is the sole heir to the estate and the controlling shares of the company. There is no dispute here. Amanda's eyes narrowed. Oh, there's a dispute. Maybe not in your legal books, Charles, but in this family, you bet there is. Greg leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. You think you can just walk into that office, sit in that chair, and run Carter Industries? You couldn't even stand up to Uncle Richard when he was alive. Now suddenly you're the man for the job? The words stung, not because they were wrong, but because they were too close to the truth. Richard had made a sport of humiliating me, of reminding me that I wasn't strong enough. And now here I was, with his empire dumped into my lap like some twisted prize. I kept my voice steady. I didn't ask for any of this, but he left it to me, not you. If you've got a problem with that, take it up with him. Greg shot to his feet, face red. He's dead, Ethan. You know damn well we can't take it up with him, but we can sure as hell take it up with you. Whitman raised his hand, his voice firm. That's enough. If either of you tries to challenge this in court, you'll lose, and you'll drain what little inheritance Richard left you in the process. My advice, accept his decision and move on. Amanda turned, her heels clicking against the polished floor as she moved toward the door. Just before stepping out, she glanced back at me. You think this is over? It's not. You don't deserve what he gave you, and we'll make sure everyone knows it. The door slammed behind her. Greg lingered just long enough to glare at me before storming out after her. The silence that followed was heavier than the confrontation itself. Whitman adjusted his glasses, sighing softly. You should be prepared, Ethan. They won't let this go. Not the house, not the company, and certainly not the legacy. I nodded, though my stomach churned. What am I supposed to do? Sit here and wait for them to come after me? Whitman's gaze was steady, unblinking. No, you do what Richard wanted. You step into his shoes. You lead. Whether you like it or not, Ethan, this was never about the house or the money. It was about whether you could survive in his world. I left the office with those words echoing in my mind. Outside, the wind cut through my coat, but it wasn't the cold that made me shiver. It was the realization that inheriting Richard's empire hadn't put an end to his games. It had just put me on the board. The storm didn't take long to break. Within a week of Richard's funeral, whispers about me taking over Carter Industries weren't whispers anymore. They were headlines. Nephew inherits company fortune, family left in the cold. Some reporters called it a bold move from a shrewd businessman. Others painted me as a fraud who'd conned his way into power. I didn't need to guess who was feeding them that angle. Amanda and Greg. They weren't just angry, they were strategic. Amanda had connections in the local press, and Greg had friends on the board of directors. Together, they launched their little crusade, telling anyone who would listen that Richard's last will was a mistake, that I wasn't fit to lead, that I was a liar who rewrote his eulogy to manipulate the narrative. For the first time in my life, I understood what it felt like to have a target painted on my back. Walking into the Carter Industries building that Monday, I could feel the shift. Employees glanced at me as I passed, their expressions polite but uncertain, like they didn't know whether to shake my hand or sharpen their knives. Richard had ruled this place with an iron grip, and now his weak nephew was sitting in his chair. I spent the day drowning in numbers, contracts, board memos, trying to act like I belonged. But every time my phone buzzed with another news alert, I felt the walls closing in. By evening, I couldn't take it anymore. I drove back to the mansion, straight to the office, and opened the safe again. This time, I dug deeper, past the photographs, past the letters, past the clean contracts that looked like window dressing. At the very bottom, I found a folder so worn the edges were frayed. Inside were documents stamped with dates going back decades. And what I saw made my blood run cold. Richard hadn't just been a ruthless businessman. He'd been dirty. There were payoffs to politicians, shell companies siphoning money, secret partnerships with names that still carried weight in the industry. And then, tucked inside, a single sheet of paper with Amanda's signature. Another with Greg's. I sat back in the leather chair, staring at those pages. My cousins had been feeding at Richard's trough all along. They weren't innocent bystanders. They were part of the machine. That's when it hit me. Their outrage, their smear campaign, their righteous fury, it wasn't about fairness. It was about fear. If I dug too deep, if I put the pieces together, the whole rotten structure could collapse on top of them. The old bastard had left me his empire, yes, but he'd also left me the leverage to protect it. I closed the folder, slid it back into the safe, and leaned against the desk. My pulse was racing, my thoughts sharp. For years, Richard had made me feel small, but maybe this was his twisted way of giving me power. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses on your chest. But I didn't feel alone anymore. I felt the weight of Richard's voice, not in my ears, but in my bones. Use it, or be destroyed. The next morning, Amanda called. No hello, no pretense, just venom. You think this is over, Ethan? We're just getting started. By the end of the month, you'll be out of that house, out of that company, and out of our lives for good. I let her talk. Let her believe she was winning. Because for the first time since Richard died, I realized something. I wasn't the one on trial anymore. They were. By the time Amanda's voice clicked off the line, my hands weren't shaking anymore. For weeks, I'd been reacting, stumbling from one blow to the next, letting their words dictate the story. But sitting in my uncle's chair, the weight of the folder still heavy in my mind, I felt something shift. For the first time, I wasn't the prey. The next board meeting was a circus. Amanda and Greg had managed to slip into the room, flanking a handful of directors they'd clearly been whispering to. The air was thick with skepticism, the kind you can't cut with any speech. I walked in, nodded politely, and sat at the head of the table, the seat Richard had occupied for 30 years. Amanda wasted no time. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice smooth and rehearsed, "I think we can all agree that Uncle Richard's decision was unusual, entrusting the future of Carter Industries to someone with no real experience, someone who stood in church and fabricated a fairy tale. It's irresponsible. We owe it to the company to reconsider." A murmur rippled around the table. I let it hang there, just long enough, before leaning forward. "I'm glad you brought that up, Amanda," I said evenly, "because I think everyone here deserves clarity about Uncle Richard, about his choices, about this company. Greg snorted. Here we go. I ignored him and reached into my briefcase. When I laid the folder on the polished wood, the room seemed to hold its breath. These, I said, sliding a few pages across to the directors, are records from Richard's personal files. Payments, contracts, partnerships, things most of you never saw. Some of these signatures may look familiar. The directors bent over the papers, eyebrows shooting up, whispers breaking out. Greg's face drained of color the second his own name appeared on one of the sheets. Amanda's mask cracked just slightly. This is absurd. Those are forged. He's desperate. I met her eyes, steady and unblinking. No, they're real. Uncle Richard didn't leave me these by accident. He left them because he knew this day would come. He knew someone would try to challenge his decision, and he wanted me armed with the truth. The room went dead quiet. For the first time, Amanda had no clever retort, no smug grin. One of the older directors cleared his throat. If what Mr. Morris says is accurate, it would be unwise to press this further. We can't afford scandal. Not now. Greg shut up from his chair, jabbing a finger at me. You think you're clever, don't you? Hiding behind Richard's shadow, waving around dirty laundry to scare people. You don't deserve any of this. My voice was calm, almost too calm. Maybe I don't, but I didn't choose it. Richard did. And unless you'd like these documents to become public record, I suggest you stop trying to undo his decision. The boardroom air thickened with tension. Greg's face twisted with rage. Amanda's jaw clenched tight. But they both knew. The fight wasn't just mine anymore. It was theirs. The meeting adjourned in uneasy silence. Directors filed out, whispering amongst themselves, their loyalty already shifting. As I'd gathered my papers, Whitman appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Richard was right about you, he said quietly. He believed you'd either break under the weight or learn how to carry it. I didn't respond. I just looked around the room, the same room where Richard had once cut me down in front of everyone, and felt something I never thought I'd feel in his shadow. Control. But as I stepped into the hallway, a chill ran through me, because I knew Amanda and Greg weren't finished, and neither was Richard's ghost.
The storm broke 2 weeks later, not in the boardroom but in the press. Someone leaked Richard's old contracts, the shady payoffs, the shell companies. Not all of it, just enough to set off alarms, and buried among the documents were Amanda and Greg's signatures. The papers hit the news like a lightning strike. Overnight, the same reporters who'd called me a fraud turned their cameras toward them. Carter heirs tied to shady deals. Their faces flashed on every local broadcast, their names dragged across headlines. For days, I stayed quiet. I didn't need to say a word. The truth had done the work for me. Amanda showed up at the mansion one night, her eyes red, her voice breaking. "You think you've won, don't you?" she hissed. "You think sitting in that chair makes you him?" I wanted to tell her no, that I wasn't Richard, that I never wanted to be. But looking at her, angry, broken, desperate, I realized something. She didn't hate me, not really. She hated him, and I was just the closest thing left to his shadow. "Richard left us all scars," I said quietly. "The difference is I'm not going to spend my life reopening them." Her lip trembled, but she didn't reply. She turned, slammed the door, and vanished into the night. Greg never came. He let his lawyers do the talking, threatening lawsuits, promising to bury me. But with every threat, the documents from the safe loomed over him like a noose. He could bark, but he couldn't bite. Not anymore. By the end of the month, the board voted unanimously to confirm me as CEO of Carter Industries. Not because they loved me, not because I'd earned it yet, but because I was the last piece of Richard's plan they could trust not to implode. And so there I was, sitting at the same desk where Richard had sat for 30 years, staring out at the skyline he once ruled. For years he'd told me I'd never be strong enough, that I didn't have the guts to lead. Maybe he'd believed that. Or maybe, in some twisted way, he'd been shaping me for this all along. That night, I went back to the safe one last time. I didn't touch the contracts or the ledgers. I pulled out the photographs instead, the ones of me as a boy, playing ball, holding a diploma, standing awkwardly at graduation. Richard had never come to those moments, never called, never clapped me on the back or said he was proud, but he'd kept the proof. He'd watched, even if from a distance, even if he couldn't show it. For the first time since the funeral, I let myself feel it. Not love, not forgiveness, but something in between. Recognition, maybe. The understanding that people are rarely just one thing. Even the cruelest man in the room can leave behind a trace of something good. I set the photos back carefully, closed the safe, and locked it. Standing alone in that office, I finally understood his final test. It wasn't about lies or legacies. It was about whether I could see the good, even in him. Whether I could carry both truths at once, that he was a bastard who hurt everyone around him, and that somewhere, buried deep, he'd still cared enough to leave me the tools to survive. The world would remember Richard Carter as a tyrant, and maybe that was fair. But I'd remember him as the man who taught me the hardest lesson of all, that strength isn't found in denying the darkness. It's found in choosing to see the light anyway.